My name is Valerie Blanchard, 31 years old. My mother spent $16,000 to make the bridal shower for my brother's fiancée look perfect. She hired the caterer everyone in the bride's wealthy circle was talking about, just to impress them. And then, after a guest bumped my elbow and a few drops of tea touched the bride's dress, she threw the cup in my face and called me worthless in front of all of them. My brother said nothing, as always. What my mother didn't know was who owned the company behind every plate of food she had paid for. By the end of that afternoon, she understood. But before I tell you how that afternoon unraveled her, you need to know who I was to this family long before that day. In my family, there were guests, and there was me. I don't say that for pity. I say it because it's the plainest way to explain how I grew up. My mother, Wanda, was known in the Wright Charleston rooms as the woman who threw the most beautiful gatherings. People said her home always smelled like fresh bread and cut flowers. They said her tables looked like magazine spreads. They said Wanda Blanchard could make anyone feel like they mattered. My hands were the reason the food worked, and almost nobody knew. From the time I was 9, the moment guests arrived, my mother pressed an apron into my hands and said the same 3 words: "Make yourself useful." I learned to move quietly along the edges of a room. I learned to refill a glass before anyone noticed it was empty. I learned to carry a tray without letting it rattle. And when a guest turned to my mother and said, "Wanda, this food is incredible," she would smile and say, "I do love hosting." She never once looked at me when she said it. My brother Grant was 3 years older, and he had a different job in our family. His job was to be seen. He sat at the table. He shook hands. He was told he had our father's easy smile. When I was scolded, he found a reason to leave the room. He wasn't cruel in the obvious way. He was just comfortable, and comfort can make a coward out of people. Grant wasn't the golden child who plotted against me. He was something quieter, and in some ways worse. He simply looked away. Every single time. There was one person who saw me. My grandmother, Ruth. My mother's mother, though you'd never guess they came from the same family. For 30 years, Ruth had run a little food trailer at the Saturday market off Meeting Street. The kind of place where people lined up in the heat just to wait. She taught me everything I know about cooking, and she taught it to me with her hands over mine. "People forget a pretty table," she used to say. "They never forget how the food made them feel." The summer I was 15, Ruth let me run her griddle alone for the first time. When a woman came back for a second helping and asked who made it, Ruth pointed at me and said, loud enough for the whole line to hear, "That one, remember her name." I have held onto that sentence my entire life. I can tell you the exact night I stopped expecting the same thing at home. I was 12. It was my birthday, and my mother had invited people over, her people, the ones she wanted to impress. I asked that afternoon if we could order the food for once, so I wouldn't have to work at my own party. My mother looked at me like I'd said something in a language she didn't speak. "You love cooking," she said. "It's your gift. Why would we hire someone when we have you?" So I made my own birthday dinner. 20 adults, a menu I'd planned for a week, a cake I'd practiced twice. And when a guest asked who'd done all this, my mother put her hand flat on her own chest and said, "Oh, we managed." Not, "Valerie made it," not, "It's her birthday." We managed. I stood there in the apron, holding the cake I'd baked for myself, and understood the rule of that house. The food would be hers, the work would be mine, and not even my own birthday changed the math. I didn't cry about it. I remember deciding, at 12, that crying about it was a waste. I went back into the kitchen and I plated dessert for 20 people, and I saved the corner piece of my own cake for last, and I ate it standing up at the counter after everyone had gone. So that was the shape of my childhood. A mother who used my hands and took the credit, a brother who watched and stayed silent, and one old woman who told the world to remember my name. I thought for a long time that if I was good enough, one day my mother would see me the way Ruth did. I was wrong about that, but it took losing almost everything to learn it. In 2013, when I was 19, I got into a culinary program. It was the first thing in my life that felt like mine. For almost 2 years, I was happy in a way I didn't have words for. Then, in the fall I turned 21, Ruth got sick. The diagnosis was the kind that comes with a calendar attached. Months, not years. She needed someone with her, someone to cook the soft foods she could still keep down, someone to sit with her through the long afternoons. There was a family meeting about it, if you can call it that. My mother ran it. "Grant has his career," she said. Grant sold commercial insurance. He nodded like a career was a medical exemption. "Valerie's the one with time." "I had school," I said so quietly. "It's a cooking class, honey," my mother said. "You can go back to a cooking class." I left the program to take care of my grandmother. I don't regret those months. They were the last good ones I had with her, and I would trade almost anything to have them again. But I want to be honest about how the decision was made. It wasn't offered to me. It was assigned to me. And the person who assigned it never once said thank you. I moved into Ruth's spare room. In the mornings, I cooked her the soft things she could still keep down. Custards, thin broths, a spoonful of peach folded into cream when she was strong enough. In the afternoons, we sat by the window and she talked, and I learned more from those afternoons than I did in 2 years of school. One day near the end, she caught my wrist while I was clearing her tray. "You're going to want them to see it," she said. She meant my mother. She meant Grant. She always knew what I wasn't saying. "You're going to build something good, and you're going to want to hold it up to them and wait." Her grip was light by then, but her eyes weren't. "Don't. Some people can only love a thing once everyone else already does. You keep waiting on that. You'll wait your whole life." I told her I understood. I didn't, not for another 9 years. But I remembered it. I remembered all of it. My mother visited twice in those 6 months. Both times she stayed under an hour, and both times she spent most of it on the phone in the driveway, planning something beautiful for someone who wasn't dying. Ruth died the following spring, when I was 22. The will was short. Grant received a portion of the savings, clean and simple. My mother took the good furniture and a modest sum. And to me, Ruth left one thing: the trailer. Inside, it was a dented metal box of her recipe cards, written in the hand I still knew better than my own. By then, it was 30 years old. The generator was dead. There was rust along the wheel wells and a soft spot in the floor near the sink. When the lawyer read it out, my mother actually laughed. Not a big laugh. A small one, through her nose, the kind meant to be shared. "That rust bucket?" she said. "Val, do yourself a favor. Scrap it. Take whatever the metal's worth." I looked at the trailer that afternoon, parked crooked in Ruth's old driveway with the paint peeling off the side. I thought about her hands over mine. I thought about a line of people in the heat. I didn't scrap it. I want you to understand what my life looked like the day I decided to keep it, because nothing about it looked like success. I was 22, with no degree and no savings. I rented a studio apartment above a laundromat where the walls were always faintly warm and smelled of dryer sheets. I worked the closing shift at a chain restaurant 6 nights a week, and I slept about 4 hours a night. My hands were always either burned or blistered or both. On my one day off, I towed the trailer to the market with a borrowed truck and a generator I bought used and paid off in installments. I sold my grandmother's recipes, her honey lavender shortbread, her brown butter peach tart. The first Saturday, I made $312 and cried in the truck afterward, not because it was a lot, but because it was mine. Not every Saturday went like that. There was a week it rained all day, and I sold $60 and sat in the trailer listening to water hit the roof, doing the math on whether the generator payment or the rent was going to lose that month. There was a morning the old generator quit halfway through service, and I finished on a camp stove and a prayer. I learned to keep a little cash taped inside the cabinet for the mornings that went wrong, because a lot of mornings went wrong. But the food kept bringing people back. That was the thing I held on to. Ruth was right. They forgot the crooked trailer and the folding table, and they remembered how the shortbread made them feel, and they came back for the feeling. There was a woman that first day who bought a bag of shortbread, walked 10 feet away, turned around, and came back for more. She told me her name was Bridget. She came back the next Saturday too, and the one after that. On the 4th week, she asked if I ever needed help because she'd been laid off from a hotel events team and she liked the way I worked. I told her I couldn't pay her yet. "I know," she said, "I'm not asking yet." Bridget Flynn is the first person who bet on me before there was anything to bet on. Remember her. She matters later. For 2 years, that was my whole world. The closing shift at night, the trailer on Saturdays, 4 hours of sleep. I was not building an empire. I was surviving. But something was happening at that market that I was too tired to see clearly. People were coming back. People were telling other people. A woman asked if I could make 200 pieces of shortbread for her daughter's christening, and I said yes before I knew how. And then I figured out how. The christening was the first time someone paid me to cater instead of to sell. I made 200 pieces of shortbread and a peach tart the size of a wagon wheel in a kitchen that wasn't built for it. And I stayed up the whole night before, and I was terrified the entire time. When the grandmother of the baby pressed an envelope into my hand at the end and told me I'd made the day, I went out to the parking lot and counted it in the dark. It was more than I made in a full week of closing shifts. By the time catering started calling to me, I had saved a little under $9,000, which felt enormous until I priced the equipment I actually needed. That was the night I understood something that changed the direction of my life. There was more money and more of a future in feeding 100 people once than in feeding 1,000 people one cookie at a time. The trailer had gotten me out of the market stall. But the work was starting to lead somewhere bigger than the trailer. But to do that, I needed real equipment. A commercial oven, a refrigerated van, insurance, permits. I needed about $28,000 I did not have. I sat with the equipment loan paperwork for a week. $28,000 was more money than I had ever owed anyone. If it failed, I would spend years paying back a debt for a business that no longer existed. I remember the night I signed it. I remember thinking that if my mother could see the number, she would tell me I was being reckless, that I was throwing good money after a rust bucket. I signed it anyway. That was the first real decision I ever made that was fully my own. In 2018, the van came first, then the oven, then the first wedding. It was small. 60 guests in a backyard in Mount Pleasant, and I did almost all of it myself with Bridget running the floor. It nearly went wrong an hour in. The rented warming units were the wrong voltage for the outlets on the property, and I stood in that backyard with trays of food going cold and a bride about to walk out to her guests. I had 10 minutes to solve it or ruin someone's wedding. I moved everything to the kitchen ovens inside, plated in shifts, and had Bridget quietly work with the maid of honor to stretch the welcome toast by a few minutes. The guests never knew. The bride never knew. I sweated through my chef's coat and got it out on time. That night taught me that half of catering is staying calm while the floor drops out from under you. The bride's aunt tracked me down at the end of the night, held my arm, and said her guests hadn't stopped talking about the food. 2 of them booked me before I'd even packed the van. That's how it worked in those early years. 1 good night led to 2 more. It was slow, and it was earned, and it was mine. By the end of that year, I had paid down a third of the loan and hired my first part-time cook. My family still did not notice. I want to be precise about that, because it's the wound underneath everything else. It wasn't that they hated my success. It's that they were incapable of registering it. When I mentioned the wedding at a family dinner, my mother asked me to help clear the plates. When I said I'd hired someone, Grant asked if I could still make his favorite dip for the holidays. My work existed to them only as a service they might use. I remember one Thanksgiving I brought it up on purpose, to test it. I'd just landed a contract that would cover my loan for the year, and I said so, out loud, at the table. My mother said, "That's good, honey. Can you check the rolls?" And turned back to a story about a woman from her garden club. Grant didn't look up from his phone. I sat in the silence where someone might have said, "Well done," and I checked the rolls. That's the thing about being invisible in a family. It isn't loud. It's 100 small rooms where you say something true and watch it land on the floor. In 2019, my mother put that plainly for me. She was throwing a 30th anniversary party for an aunt and uncle, and she called to tell me, not ask, tell, that I would be handling the food as a family favor. "It's family," she said when I mentioned my rate. "You're not going to charge family." I catered that party for free. 200 people. A full day of my time, plus food, supplies, rentals, and labor that came close to $8,000 I quietly ate. And at the party, when the guests raved, I watched my mother stand at the center of the room and say, "Oh, I put this whole thing together myself. It's a labor of love." I was standing 10 feet away in an apron, holding a tray. I didn't argue. I remember thinking that arguing had never once worked, not in my entire life, and that the only thing worse than being invisible would be to beg to be seen and fail. So I said nothing. I let the silence sit. I drove home that night and did not cry, which frightened me because it meant I was getting used to it. Then came 2020, and the year almost took everything. When the shutdowns hit, every event on my calendar canceled inside of 2 weeks. Weddings, showers, a corporate contract I'd been counting on. All of it gone, along with product orders and prep costs I had already paid for. By that April, I had $180 in my business account and a loan payment due that I could not make. I sat in my van in an empty parking lot and did the math over and over as if a different answer would appear. It didn't. I was going to lose the business, lose the trailer, call the bank, and prove my mother right. Bridget is the reason I didn't. She showed up at my apartment with a whiteboard and an idea. Nobody could gather, but everybody still had to eat, and everyone was terrified and exhausted and grieving. "People don't want a cookie right now," she said. "They want to feel taken care of." We started making family meal boxes, a full dinner for 4, dropped on a doorstep, made from Ruth's recipes, the food that tasted like being cared for. We were both wrong about the shortbread, by the way. People wanted that too. They wanted it most of all. The first week, we did 9 boxes. I drove half of them myself. One went to a woman my age who'd just lost her father and couldn't summon the will to feed her own kids. She emailed me that night. She said the dinner was the first thing that had tasted like anything in a month, and that for one evening her house had felt like it used to. I read it in the van in her driveway, and I sat with it for a long time. That was when I stopped thinking of what I did as cooking. Ruth had told me the truth years earlier, and I'd only heard the words. People don't remember the table. They remember how the food made them feel. I was in the business of making people feel taken care of, and it turned out the whole world needed that at once. It saved us. Barely at first, then, through repeat orders, referrals, and families sending boxes to other families. By the end of that year, we had a waiting list. There's a moment in that stretch I keep. I finally rented a small licensed kitchen, a real one, with a walk-in cooler and a hood system, and a certificate on the wall with my name on it. The first morning, it was mine. I got there before the sun, and I stood in the middle of the empty stainless steel room, and I didn't do anything for a while. I just stood there. 4 years since the market. 2 since I signed for a loan I was terrified of. And I hired my first full-time cook that week, a young woman named Nora, who worked twice as hard as anyone I'd ever met. And I got to be the person who told her out loud, "That's perfect. Don't change a thing." I remembered being 15 and hearing that from Ruth. I remembered how it had held me up my whole life. I got to hand it to someone else. By the end of that stretch, we stopped being a trailer with a van attached and became a real company. We needed a name. Bridget wanted something with my grandmother in it, so we called it Ivy and Ash. Ivy for the plant Ruth kept twisting up the side of her trailer, ash for the fire that everything good comes out of. I painted the name on the side of the van myself. Here is a detail I need you to hold on to, because it becomes the hinge of everything. As we grew, Bridget became the face of Ivy and Ash by design. She took the calls, met the clients, walked the venues, and signed the client-facing contracts. I stayed in the kitchen, where I belonged, and where I wanted to be, building the thing people came back for. To our clients, I was a first name on a menu note or invoice line. Chef Val. No surname. Most of them never met me at all. That's not a coincidence I'm setting up. That's just how catering works. You fall in love with the food. You rarely meet the hands. In the spring of 2022, a woman I had never met changed my life without knowing it. She hired us through Bridget for a small dinner party, 12 people, old Charleston money, the kind of client we'd never cracked before. I made Ruth's menu, the shortbread, the peach tart, a slow-cooked short rib that had become our signature. I never left the kitchen. I never saw the room. The next morning, Bridget called me while I was still in bed. "Val, you need to sit up for this." The host had called her at 8 a.m. Her name was Eleanor Ashford, and in a city like Charleston, that name was a door. It was the same small, polished world my mother had spent her life trying to enter from the outside. She had, in Bridget's words, lost her mind in the nicest way over the food. She wanted to know if we could handle a garden luncheon for 40 and a foundation gala after that. And she had already, before breakfast, told 6 of her friends about the most extraordinary little caterer she'd found. I sat up in bed, and I put my hand over my mouth, and I did not make a sound. The garden luncheon was the test, and I knew it. 40 women who could end a caterer's reputation over a single dry chicken breast. I cooked for 2 days. I sent Bridget to run the room because Bridget was the face, and I stayed in the borrowed kitchen where I could watch every plate leave. Near the end, Eleanor came back looking for whoever was responsible, but I was outside checking the van and the next tray of tart shells, so she found Bridget and thanked her warmly by name. That's how it kept happening. Eleanor loved Ivy and Ash. Eleanor knew Bridget. Eleanor had never once laid eyes on me. In her mind, I was a first name on an invoice. Chef Val, the woman who made the shortbread. That's how it happened. Not luck, exactly. Eleanor Ashford opened a door, but I had spent 9 years learning to walk through it. Over the next 2 years, Ivy and Ash became the name people in that world dropped at their own parties. The garden luncheon led to the gala. The gala led to 3 weddings. There was a season I turned away more work than I took. And I remember standing in my kitchen the first time I said no to a client because I was full and thinking that the girl in the truck at the market would not have believed me. By 2024, we were booked 9 months out, running a team of 6, doing something close to $420,000 a year in gross revenue. I bought a small house with a real kitchen, and in the driveway, I finally started to restore my grandmother's trailer. New floor, rebuilt generator, a fresh coat of paint in the exact green Ruth used to use. Not to sell, not to use even, just to look at. I still didn't scrap it. I want to tell you that success healed the thing between me and my mother. It didn't. It couldn't, because she never let it in. I mailed her the local magazine feature when it ran. A full page, my photo, the whole story of the trailer and the market and Ruth. I told myself I wasn't looking for her approval. I was 30 years old, but I checked my phone all day. Her reply came that evening. One line. That's nice. Are you coming to Grant's engagement? I read it 4 times, then I put the phone face down, and I finished cooking dinner for a client who had never once made me feel small. Grant, it turned out, had gotten engaged to a woman named Adeline Ashford. I didn't make the connection at first. Charleston is big until it isn't, especially in the kind of rooms where my brother sold insurance and my mother wanted to be seen. It was only when Grant mentioned offhand that his fiancée's mother throws these unbelievable parties that something cold moved through me. I asked the mother's name. Eleanor, he said. Why? No reason, I said. My brother was marrying the daughter of the woman who had built my career, and he had no idea because he had never once asked me a single real question about my life. My 2 worlds had walked straight into each other, and I was the only person in the room who could see it. I should have said something then, I know that. But there was a part of me, a small, stubborn, 22-year-old part of me still sitting in a truck at a market, that wanted, just once, to be inside that world as a person and not as the help. So I stayed quiet, and I told myself the truth would sort itself out on its own. It did, just not the way I imagined. The engagement moved fast. By early fall of 2025, a wedding was being planned, and my mother had inserted herself into every corner of it. She had decided, somewhere in her mind, that the Ashfords were the family we were meant to belong to, and she was going to earn our place at that table if it killed her, which is how she came to insist on hosting the bridal shower herself. It was unusual. Showers are usually the bride's side, her friends, her people. But my mother pushed until it was hers to plan, framing it as generosity, and the Ashfords let her have it with the polite bafflement of people who have learned not to fight over small things. My mother was going to throw the most beautiful shower Charleston had ever seen. She was going to prove to Eleanor Ashford that Wanda Blanchard belonged, and she was going to hire the caterer everyone in the Ashfords' circle had been talking about. I found out on a Tuesday. A booking came into our public office, forwarded to me by our coordinator, because the budget flag was high. $16,000, a bridal shower. The client name was Wanda Blanchard. The event was for Adeline Ashford and Grant Blanchard. On the client-facing side, it was all Ivy and Ash, Bridget Flynn, and Chef Val. I read it 3 times, standing in my own kitchen, and the floor seemed to tilt. My mother had hired my company. She had gone looking for the caterer everyone in the Ashfords world whispered about, and she had found Ivy and Ash. She had booked Ivy and Ash, paid the retainer through the office, and she did not know. She didn't know because she had never asked what I did. In 31 years, she had never learned the name of my company. To her, my work was a cooking class, a rust bucket, a labor of love she could take credit for. She could not imagine, literally could not construct the thought, that her daughter ran the very thing she was paying a fortune to impress the Ashfords with. Her contempt was so complete that it had made her blind. I sat down on the kitchen floor with my back against the cabinets, and I stayed there for a while. Bridget found me. She read the booking over my shoulder and went very still. "Cancel it," she said. "Refer them out. You don't have to do this to yourself." I thought about canceling it. I really did. But something quieter than anger, moved in me. My mother was spending $16,000 to look perfect in front of the people I actually worked for, and some small, stubborn part of me still wanted to stand in that room and be seen. Not as help, not as the girl with an apron, as family, as the person who had built the thing she had finally decided was worth buying. That night I drove home and sat in my driveway with the headlights off, looking at Ruth's trailer where it sat, half restored under a tarp. I thought about what she'd told me at the window. You're going to want them to see it, and you're going to wait. I had built a whole life on top of that warning, and I still hadn't learned it because here I was, 31 years old, holding a booking from my own mother and feeling the same thing I'd felt at 12 with a birthday cake in my hands. The hope, the awful, patient hope that this would be the time. I knew what Ruth would have said. I booked it anyway. I want to do it, I said the next morning at the office. Bridget crouched down in front of me. She has known me a long time. Val, she said gently, you keep hoping she'll change. She's not going to change. I know, I said. It wasn't quite a lie. But I want to be there as Grant's sister. Bridget runs the service. The team treats me like any other guest. Just once, I want to be in that room as family and not as staff. I looked at her. Don't put me on the paperwork. Don't tell the team to treat me like the owner. Nobody says who I am. Let me just be there. She didn't like it, but she agreed. We planned the menu I would have made for someone I loved. Ruth's shortbread, the peach tart, the short rib, the best of everything, given away in secret to people who had never given me anything. I told you, the small, stubborn part of me was dangerous. This is what I meant. Not because I wanted revenge, because I still, after everything, wanted my mother to love me. The shower was on a Saturday afternoon in November. At a rented waterfront estate, my mother had clearly stretched to book. 60 guests, the entire Ashford family. Half of Charleston society that my mother had spent a decade trying to charm. I arrived as a guest in a dress I'd bought for the occasion, and it was strange to walk in the front door of my own event. My team was already working, and they were good, and not one of them looked at me twice. Bridget caught my eye once across the room and gave me the smallest nod. My mother was radiant, I'll give her that. She moved through the room in pale blue, touching elbows, laughing at the right moments, and I watched people fall for her exactly the way they always had. She had built her whole life around this, being seen as perfect in front of the right people. And today, the right people were the Ashfords, and the picture was flawless. I heard her more than once tell a small group how much thought she'd put into the menu. I found the most wonderful caterer, she said, near the raw bar my team had built. The best in the city, apparently. Nothing but the best for our families. A woman asked her the name of the company. My mother waved a hand and said, "Oh, I'd have to check." The office handled the details and moved the conversation along. She was paying $16,000 for a name she couldn't be bothered to remember, and it was her own daughter's, and she stood 20 feet from me and didn't feel it. I want you to sit in that for a second because I had to. The whole story of my family was standing in that room, dressed in pale blue, taking credit for my hands in front of the only people she'd ever wanted, and not knowing the hands were mine. It took her about 10 minutes to put me to work. "Valerie?" She caught my arm as I passed, her voice warm for the guests and flat for me. "Go make sure the Ashfords' table has fresh tea, and smile for God's sake. Make yourself useful." The words landed exactly where they'd landed when I was 9. I could have said no. I owned the company serving this party. I was a guest at my brother's shower. But some habits are carved too deep to argue with in the moment. I took the tray. Across the room, Eleanor Ashford was watching me. She'd been watching me on and off for 20 minutes with a small, puzzled look, the way you look at someone you're sure you know from somewhere. When I set the tea at her table, she said, "Have we met? You seem so familiar." And then she took a piece of the shortbread from the tray, bit into it, and her face changed. "Oh," she said softly, "this is my caterer's shortbread. I've served it at half my parties by now. I'd know it anywhere." She looked up at me. "How funny." Bridget appeared at my shoulder before I had to answer and steered me away with a hand on my back. Her eyes said, "That was close." Mine said, "I know." The other thing I saw near the bar was Adeline. My future sister-in-law had watched my mother order me around, and she wasn't smiling. Earlier, I'd caught her frowning when my mother snapped at me in the hall by the kitchen. Adeline was the only person in that family who had ever said thank you to me. She was a kind woman, marrying into something she was only beginning to understand, and I could see the understanding starting to arrive. She came over to me at one point quietly while I was refilling water at the far table. "Are you okay?" she asked. "She talks to you like—" She stopped herself, looking for a word that wouldn't be an accusation against the family she was about to join. She didn't find one. "You don't have to wait on people today. You're his sister. Sit down, please." "It's fine," I said. "It's the thing you say." "I don't mind." But she kept watching my mother across the room, the crease between her eyebrows deeper than before. I could see the question forming in her face. If this was how Wanda spoke to her own daughter on a good day, in front of guests, what would a bad day look like? I didn't answer it for her. My mother was about to. Near the end, my mother pulled me aside by the kitchen door where no one could hear. "Listen to me." She was still smiling for the room, but her grip on my wrist was tight. "This family runs on the Ashfords now. Whatever it is you do for a living, do not embarrass me today. You owe me that." I looked at her hand on my wrist and thought, very clearly, "You have no idea what I do for a living. That is the whole story of us." Then I picked up the tea tray, because the Ashfords' table needed refreshing, and I walked toward the bride. I was setting a fresh cup at Adeline's place when a guest stepped back from the bar without looking and clipped my elbow. The tray tipped. A few drops of warm tea spilled over the rim and touched the hem of Adeline's dress. A few drops. My mother saw it from across the room. I have replayed what happened next more times than I can count, and it still moves too fast. She crossed the room, picked up the warm cup from the tray, and threw it in my face. The tea was warm. It ran down my forehead, off my chin, onto the collar of the dress I'd bought to feel like a person. "Worthless," she said, loud. Loud enough that the room, which had been full of soft conversation, went completely silent. "You can't even serve guests. This is why I hired professionals." Grant was standing 8 feet away. My brother, the groom, at his own bride's shower. He looked down at the floor. He did not move. 31 years, and even now, even here, he looked at the floor. I didn't wipe my face. I stood there, tea dripping off my chin onto the marble, and I let the room hold its breath. I want to tell you I felt powerful. I didn't. I felt 9 years old. And then a hand closed around mine. Eleanor Ashford had risen from her chair and crossed the room, and she took my wet hand in both of hers, and she looked at me with an expression I had waited my whole life to see on my mother's face. "I didn't know," she said quietly, "that you suffered like this." Then she turned to my mother, and her voice was no longer soft. "Wanda, do you honestly not know who this is?" My mother's smile flickered. That's my daughter, Eleanor. She's just helped today. She is Val," Eleanor said. "This is the woman behind Ivy and Ash, the caterer I have sent to you, and to everyone we know, for 3 years." She was still holding my hand. "The company you hired, the best in the city. You threw tea in her face." The silence changed shape. I watched it move across 60 faces. My mother laughed, the small laugh through her nose. There's some confusion. Valerie sells cookies at a market. Bridget stepped forward from the wall where she'd been standing. "Mrs. Blanchard," she said, "I'm the operations manager for Ivy and Ash. Valerie Blanchard is the owner and executive chef. Your $16,000 contract, the menu, the team, the food you've praised all afternoon, all of it is hers." Bridget looked around the frozen room, then back at my mother. Her hands made it, and then Eleanor said the thing that broke it open completely. "At that shortbread." She was looking at my mother now with something close to pity. "The recipe I've loved for 3 years, the one I serve at every party I host." She turned to me, gentle again. "That was your grandmother's, wasn't it?" "Ruth's," I said. It was the first word I'd spoken. Yes, the thing my mother had called a rust bucket. The woman she'd laughed about at a will reading. That recipe, that legacy, was the exact thing that had won over the family she'd spent $16,000 and every ounce of her dignity trying to impress. My mother was still holding an empty teacup. I watched it start to shake in her hand, a small china rattle against the saucer, and I understood that she had finally, for the first time in her life, run out of a room to perform for. She did the only thing she knew how to do. She reached for the story. "Well," her voice climbed toward the guests, bright and desperate. "Of course she's talented. I raised her. She gets that from me. I've supported this little business of hers from the very—" "You told me to scrap the trailer," I said. I didn't say it loudly. I said it the way you set something heavy down after carrying it a long way. "You told me to take it to a junkyard and sell it for the metal. You catered your own daughter for free and stood in the middle of the room and called it your labor of love. You never once, in my entire life, asked me the name of my company." I finally reached up and wiped the tea from my chin. "You didn't hire professionals, Mom. You hired the daughter you threw away, and I would have done this whole day for free, gladly, if you had ever once asked me what I do." Adeline stood up. She looked at Grant, who was still studying the floor. She looked at my mother, at the shaking cup, and she said, to no one and everyone, "If this is how you treat your own daughter, the one who built all of this, then I need to think very hard about what marrying into this family means for me." Then she walked over and stood beside me. Charles Ashford, Adeline's father, a man who had said maybe 6 words to my mother all afternoon, set his glass down on the table with a small, final click. "Wanda," he said, not unkindly, which somehow made it worse, "I think it's time we went." He didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. In that room, in that world, the quiet ones are the ones with the power, and everyone heard the door close in his sentence. One by one, the Ashfords rose from their chairs and stood too, not dramatically, just quietly, the way people move when they've decided which side of a room they belong on. Their friends stood after them. The garden club women my mother had spent a decade collecting looked at their laps, at the exits, anywhere but at her. And my mother stood alone in the center of the most beautiful party she had ever thrown, in a rented house she couldn't afford, holding a cup that wouldn't stop shaking. She had spent 31 years making sure the picture was perfect. She had used my hands to paint it and my silence to frame it. And now the picture was finished, and everyone was finally looking at it, and it showed exactly who she was. I set down the tray. I untied the apron someone had handed me at the door, folded it once, and laid it on the table. I didn't need it anymore. The private part came later, after most of the guests had gone, in the estate's kitchen where my team was quietly breaking down the last of the service. My mother found me there? Of course she did. It was the only room in the house where she'd ever known where to find me. "You humiliated me," she said. Her public voice was gone. What was left was smaller and harder. "In front of everyone, in front of the Ashfords, do you have any idea what you've done to this family?" "I didn't do anything," I said. "I poured tea. You threw it." She switched, the way she always could, from attack to arrangement. "Look, let's be reasonable. This can still be fixed. You cater the wedding for free, call it family, and everyone sees us come together. We put this behind us. We're family, Valerie. Family forgives. There it was, the oldest tool she owned. Turn the daughter back into the free labor and call it forgiveness. I know, I said. Grant came in then. He stood in the doorway the way he'd stood in doorways his whole life, halfway in, ready to leave. Val, he said. I'm sorry. I am. I didn't know it would blow up like this. He rubbed the back of his neck. I knew you had a catering thing going. I just never really looked. And there it was, from him. The whole truth of my brother, in one sentence. He hadn't hated me. He'd just never looked. Not once. His silence had never been an accident. It was a choice he had made until it felt natural. I know you're sorry, I told him. But you're sorry it got loud. You're not sorry for the 30 years it was quiet. I picked up my knife roll from the counter. That's not the same thing, and I think you still don't understand why it should be. He didn't answer. He looked down. My mother tried once more. Valerie, I'm your mother. A mistake is a mistake. A mistake is one moment, I said. You made the same choice for 31 years. That's not a mistake. That's who you decided to be. I zipped the knife roll closed. I'm not going to be the help anymore. Not yours, not Grant's, not this family's. And I'm not going to keep waiting in your kitchen to be told I'm worth something. I already know what I'm worth. It just took me a long time to stop asking you. I walked out through the front door of my own event, past the last of the flowers wilting in the November light, and I drove home. I didn't cry, but this time it wasn't because I was numb. It was because, for the first time, there was nothing left in me that needed to. Some things I heard about later, secondhand, the way you hear about weather in a place you've left. Adeline called off the wedding a few weeks after the shower. Not in anger, from what I understand, but with the clear eyes of a woman who had seen exactly what she would be marrying into and decided she deserved better. Grant finally raised his voice at our mother, not for me, I suspect, but because she had cost him the marriage. That was its own kind of sad and not my burden to carry. And Wanda Blanchard, the woman known in the right Charleston rooms for beautiful gatherings, became known for something else. The story traveled the way stories travel in a small society. The mother who threw tea in her own daughter's face. The daughter who turned out to be the finest caterer in town. The perfect picture my mother had spent a lifetime protecting, cracked in front of the only people she'd ever wanted to impress, and she cracked it with her own hand. She lost the Ashfords. She lost the marriage she'd been trying to buy her way into. She lost me completely. Grant was angry with her too, but whatever remained between them was no longer mine to measure or carry. I built something different out of what was left. By June, Ivy and Ash was thriving. We had already been planning the move before the shower, and that spring we took over a proper commissary on the edge of the city, with room for the whole team and a training space in the back. By the entrance, where everyone can see it, we parked my grandmother's trailer. Fully restored now, that exact market green. The rust bucket my mother told me to scrap, standing in the place of honor at the front of everything I've built. I started a small program out of that training space, just a handful of women at a time, women rebuilding their lives out of hard years, divorces, layoffs, the kind of family that makes you forget your own worth. I teach them to cook. I teach them Ruth's recipes. And when one of them gets it right for the first time and looks up, startled, waiting to see if it's really good, I make sure I'm looking right at her when I tell her yes. The first group had only just begun by then. One woman, older than me, had spent 20 years being told by a husband that she couldn't do anything on her own. The first time her shortbread came out right, she stood there with the oven mitts and started to cry. She apologized for crying. I told her she never had to apologize to me for taking up space. Then I told the room what Ruth once told a line of strangers about me. I pointed at her and said, "Remember her name." Eleanor and I are still close. She wasn't a door I used. She turned out to be a friend. We still argue happily about the peach tart. My mother sent a text in May. 3 sentences, an apology of a kind, the kind that spends more words explaining itself than saying sorry. I read it. I didn't delete it. I also didn't answer it, not yet, and maybe not ever. And I've made my peace with not knowing which. Forgiveness, if it ever comes, will come on my clock and for my own reasons, not because someone finally needs me to hand it over. There's a teapot in my new kitchen, an old one of Ruth's. In the mornings, before the team arrives, I make myself a cup and I drink it standing by the window that looks out on the trailer. Nobody hands me an apron. Nobody tells me to make myself useful. I pour the tea for myself now, in my own building, on ground that belongs to me. My grandmother told a line of strangers a long time ago to remember my name. It took me 31 years, a rust bucket, and 1 thrown cup of tea to understand that the only person who ever really needed to remember it was me. If you've ever been the one in the kitchen while someone else took the credit, if you've ever been handed the thing nobody wanted and told to be grateful for it, or made to feel that your worth was something a family got to grant you or take away, I hope you heard yourself somewhere in this. You don't owe your success to the people who couldn't see you. You don't have to keep waiting in anyone's kitchen to be told you matter. I'd love to know, if you're willing to share it, what's the thing someone told you to throw away that you kept anyway? And what did you build out of it?